Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbil Rohaj and I'm a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And as always, I'm joined by Julia Joja, who's a Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington and teaches at Georgetown and George Washington Universities. On our podcast, we discuss the security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let us start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. So our episode is a bit special in the sense that we are recording it from different continents. I'm currently in Italy on a little trip through Europe, and I've been having interesting conversations, predominantly in Brussels, on the state of the war and on kind of the security outlook of especially Eastern Europe. And the news that I sort of continue hearing is not particularly cheerful. So whether it's the front line, where, as one of my interlocutors put it, the accumulation of small tactical gains by the Russians might sooner rather than later be translated into a significant strategic advantage. So the way we sort of communicate this is small tactical gains, nothing to worry about, but it's consistent and this pattern has been going on for a very long time. Well, I can't sort of talk about who told me what, because these were kind of Chatham House rule conversations. But one observation that was made, and I'm just sort of offering it to our listeners, caveat emptor, is that there is a view in some circles that the Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians, clever as it was not exactly a success in one important sense. That the hope was to ensure that the Russians took the bait and that they sort of relocate a big part of their force to the defense of Russia's territory proper, and that didn't happen. In a way, Putin didn't take the bait, and he continues to sort of chip away at Ukraine's territory in the Donbass, while Ukrainians might be faced over time with greater and greater difficulties and questions about how exactly they want to keep this piece of Russian territory that they are holding. So the news from the front line is not exactly encouraging, and I think what's even worse is the sort of, I don't want to say complacency, but the paralysis that you see in Europe. So some Europeans have been telling me that, look, we are sort of in the process of waiting for the results of the US elections, and there is a sort of transition within the EU institutions. The new commission probably won't be in place until late November. Basically nothing is happening, nobody has authority to do anything, nothing can be done. And well, guess what? In Russia, run by one man, things can get done. And I want to actually sort of talk a little bit about what that means specifically for the defense industry, but I think I'm sort of monologuing for far too long. So Julia, why don't you react to this? Maybe I'm just being grumpy because Brussels is grey and there's sort of culturally embedded level of pessimism in Europe that Americans might not share. So maybe it looks different from Washington. So please tell me I'm wrong.
Unfortunately, no. Let me add a little bit to it, and maybe that segues us to the military-industrial base, which is the underlying piece of really content, and we're just towing around it with politics. So yesterday, I was in a conversation, also Chatham House, with colleagues from Germany and other couple more Europeans as well as Americans, and we were obviously talking about, I'm guessing, what you talked about in Brussels yesterday, and that is Trump's chances to return to the White House that are looking increasingly concrete or increasingly high, and what that would mean, obviously, for Ukraine. And we don't need to state here on the podcast one more time that this would be a major loss. Ukraine would be a major loss for the standing of the United States in the world, not just on the Eastern Front. But beyond that, my colleagues were saying the following. They said they would never admit it, but the European leaders of EU and NATO member states, most of them, not all of them, would secretly be thrilled if Trump comes to power and resolves the conflict in a bad way, because they are in election cycles too, and it is increasingly hard for them to argue in front of their public spending more money on Ukraine. That's how they put it. I think it's very sobering. It's cynical, but I think it's true. And so the question is, so what would those do that would consider this appeasement, such as the Baltic countries, Finland, and others? And the truth is, they were saying that, and I wonder, Dalibor, if you see it differently, if you're a little less cynical than they were, but it sounded realistic to me to say, well, they will be having loud voices, but there's little that they do. So the big question is, if Trump returns to the White House, if he follows through with a forced, whatever you want to call it, ceasefire, peace negotiation, negotiations in which that will be undoubtedly be read as a loss for Ukraine, defeat of Ukraine, and a win for Russia, then what does Europe do? And I have one more piece to add here. I don't remember if we mentioned it in passing, but I think it's really important here because it's a big chunk of money. The fact that Viktor Orban of Hungary has blocked the possibly 50 billion financial package as a loan based on windfall profits of the Russian assets in Europe, a loan that is packaged with the United States. And he said, I will not be voting on this until the US election. There's more to it in the sense that this is about long-term versus short-term commitments, 6 months renewal of sanctions and the loan implications versus 36 months, what the Biden administration and the commission are asking for. And essentially, if I am to read into the nitty-gritty, what Orban is trying to do, that Orban, who seems to be very close to Trump, is to make sure that there will not be further long-term costs for Russia, and that this peace deal, if it goes through, if Trump wins, will also mean lifting of most, if not all, of the sanctions on Russia, which will have devastating consequences, of course, for European security, because we all know Russia is going to rearm. So with that piece of additional kind of data, turning it back to you, Dalibor, to say here in Washington, Europeans and Americans think if Trump comes, Europeans will just accept that. Do you see anything different? And what does that say then about, or how do we connect this to the military industrial base?
So first of all, on that assistance package backed by the frozen assets of Russia's central bank, I had one conversation that sort of revolved around this, which was absolutely fascinating. It looks like Orban succeeded in creating a complete catch-22 situation. So, as our listeners might know, there's these 200 billion euros in Russian central bank assets held in Belgium, in Euroclear, that have been frozen. But the way the sanctions are designed because of Hungary's pressure is that they have to be frozen anew every 6 months. What that means is that it's difficult to use the proceeds from them as collateral for a loan that would help Ukraine, because any bank looks at this revenue stream and has no guarantee that this revenue stream will continue beyond 6 months. And apparently, so one story is that in Washington, the Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, federal bureaucracy, says that we can't really borrow this way, and that's why the EU has basically decided to go at it alone with a 35 billion euro package, which I'm not sure is sort of formally raised on financial markets against this sort of collateral, but they're just going to do it. They're going to take unused money from elsewhere in the multi-annual financial framework, give it to the Ukrainians, and then sort of hope to figure it out later. And Orban is saying no. And so we are recording this on Wednesday, and Thursday, Friday is the European Council where this is supposed to be resolved, but nobody really knows whether that's going to be resolved. I mean, it's a lot of money. It is important for Ukraine when it's headed into a cold winter. The humanitarian aspects to all this, infrastructure, energy, all of this, and Ukrainians are being held hostage by this one guy who basically what he wants, I think more than anything, is again like access to some of the EU funds targeted at Hungary so that his cronies can continue to get rich. To your question, what would happen if Trump tried to force some sort of harebrained scheme on the Ukrainians? I think it would divide Europe in a major way. It would put the most Atlanticist countries in Europe in a real bind. The Baltic states, Poland, Finland, the most sort of committed to the alliance with the United States, simultaneously countries that have good reasons to see the Russian threat as existential. I talked to some Balts, and they don't like being called Balts. That's another story. But they're mined roads in Latvia and Lithuania, the dragon teeth on border crossings with Russia. I mean, these people are seriously preparing for war, and the problem is that they lack the depth of the industrial base to sustain that war. And Europe as a collective body lacks that depth. And it's not even clear that the United States has the sort of mojo to really crank up military production in the way Russians are able to. And so I want to put some numbers on that, because I think that's really important. So there was a report by the Kiel Institute, it's the the one that tracks aid to Ukraine, but does economic research. So very, very sort of illustrious German organization. So they published a paper in September that looks at the state of Russian military production, taking into account the assistance from North Korea and other places. So they find that Russians are firing on average 10,000 rounds per day. That's shells and rockets. And they don't run into the trouble of kind of running out of ammunition. If the German Bundeswehr tried to do the same thing, to fire 10,000 rounds per day, they would just run out in 70 days, taking into account whatever Germany produces or is able to buy. So that is really worrying. Germany obviously donated some of its stocks to Ukraine, but also we just let some of its equipment just rot without replacing it. So if Germany's Bundeswehr were to return to its 2004 levels in terms of capabilities at the current rate at which new stuff is being purchased, it will take 15 years to get back to the 2004 level in terms of combat aircraft. It will take 40 years to get back to the 2004 level in terms of tanks. It will take 100 years to take Germany back to the 2004 level in terms of the number of its howitzers. So really, I don't know how to call it. Like, we are not taking this seriously. I think it's sort of a big part of Europe and the Western world is just not taking this seriously. And the Balts and Poles can do whatever they want, but they just don't have the factories. They don't, like Rheinmetall is a great company. Apparently they've been doing, some amazing work lately, but they need the contracts. They need the government money. Like, they have to pay their workers. They have to buy the equipment somewhere. They have to buy the steel somewhere. And that's what governments are set up to do. And I think we are sort of failing miserably on a ground scale. And I fear that things will have to get much worse for us to take it seriously. And I fear that, some of my sort of interlocutors are from yesterday and Monday, and sort of Finns and Latvians, like, they'll be in countries that will be the first victims of this.
Absolutely. And that then maybe is a good segue. I saw this a couple of days ago and I was shocked. I don't know why it didn't make it to the news. That's what I would call deterrence, and Poland taking the place of the United States. In this instance, Polish general, I believe, chief of the armed forces, said a few days ago that if Russia attacks the Baltic countries, all of them, but particularly in reference to Lithuania, it will not take days, but it will take minutes until Poland is firing at everything in Russia in a radius of 300 miles and is bombing St. Petersburg.
Good on them.
That is called deterrence, and that is what the United States is supposed to be doing, posturing and saying, if you come close, Russia, we will make sure you will not come closer. But we're not doing that. Poland can do that for the Baltic countries, which is absolutely spectacular. And I don't know that we've had this instance before in the region, certainly not. And it has the depth. And if I were Russia, I would go around Poland indeed. But that's the only thing that we have in the region. And Poland can only do so much and only for so long without having other countries' support. So that's a very sad note to finish on. But whether Trump comes to power or we have, as we discussed, Kamala Harris in the White House, a big difference this will not make, because either way, I do not see the transatlantic community preparing to enable Ukraine to win in the next 2 years.
Let us now turn to our second segment and our special guest, Lesia Orobets. Lesia is a former legislator from Ukraine and the founding director of the Secure Sky initiative. It's great to have you on the show. Why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, both in civil society, in Ukrainian politics, and anti-corruption activism. What was your professional path over the past 15, 20 years? I know that you were among the youngest, if not the youngest, member of the Verkhovna Rada at some point. Tell us about that experience, about the change of 2014, and where you are professionally today.
Thank you so much for inviting. I really enjoy being here in the studio, Dalibor. And thank you so much for having this conversation, this podcast. This is truly very important. But myself, shortly, I served my country for 8 years as the member of the parliament. My main focus was first, when things were not that bad, that was education. I stood behind one of the most prominent educational reform, something like American SAT test in Ukrainian, it's ZNO, where we significantly improved the way how kids can get to universities based on their experience, based on their knowledge, and not on bribes or connections of their parents, which made a huge difference. And, one of the factors of our resistance these days. When things got south and Yanukovych became president, I was in the opposition. That cost me dear, because at that time, that was not just, like being political opposition, that was threats, that was attacks on my family, and many other things. And we survived. We came through united, and there was another Maidan. Actually, I participated in two Maidans, but that was one of the biggest changes, 2014. And after that Maidan, Putin understood finally that Ukraine chose to be with the Western world and attack us. So that's how the situation went, and this is my personal story too. So during Yanukovych time, I specifically tackled anti-corruption matters, because at that time corruption was really huge and really the big matter, but no one was free to speak about that. No one was brave enough to come up with this point. Unlike today, because today we do have a civic society, we have NGOs, we have opposition in place able to handle the civic control over governmental purchases, and I'm happy to say that a lot has been done over those 10 years. So that's me, and right now I'm focused on what I believe one of the most critical issues in this war, meaning the protection of Ukrainian sky. And from what we figured out, we are in the middle of so-called missile crisis, meaning that our Soviet stocks are already running out. They helped us through the first 2 years of war, but right now we are very low on those stocks. And at the same time, our Western partners are doing their best, but not to the speed that we would want to regain that supply. And every attack that Russia targets on our heads can end up badly because of that. So that's why the Safe Sky Initiative, and that's why they're advocating for better supply, better production, and better sanctions against Russia in producing rockets.
So tell us a little bit more about the initiative. But before you do that, if you want to contextualize it a little bit with some numbers or a projection in terms of the frequency of Russian attacks. In the media, of course, Ukraine has stopped being on the front page for about a year after October 7th. So that means that in terms of our awareness of how much Ukraine is essentially being bombed, the awareness has been reduced, but that doesn't mean that the frequency has. So if you are to look back onto the last few months, up to a year, how bad is the situation on the ground in terms of Russian attacks? And what is your initiative then all about, and how is it trying to address that?
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for this question. Problem is that Russians somehow managed to increase their production of both missiles and drones. And we already feel that in Kyiv and in whole territory of Ukraine. In September last month, there hasn't been a single day without the drone and or missile attack. Like every single day, they managed to pull up things from their airdromes and send it our way. So from what we know, Russia increased the production of rockets by 50% over the last year, like 23 to 24. Those big attacks, like complex attacks with up to 100 missiles at once, with drones that preside the attack, they take place like every other month or month and a half. Despite not being publicized in Western media, those have drastic attacks. And even if you have news about that child's hospital, the Ahmedit, believe me, the attacks of this scale were numerous this year. And this is the huge psychological factor that Russians are trying to use against Ukrainians, because what we've noticed that after every attack like that, the polls show that the number of people who are willing to surrender or just for that thing to end grow slightly, but grow. So this is Russian way to psychologically attack Ukrainians and influence them. And I could only add that this is a very KGB tactics. If you had ever read the books about dissidents, they mentioned that in KGB prisons, they were going through sleep deprivation, which was a torture made on purpose. No one would have seen any signs on the body of that, but still that was the very effective way to make a person sign whenever witness they wanted. So this experiment they are trying to do in the whole country scale, because for people this is hard. And just to mention another aspect is the attack over power grid system. We've already lost something about 50% of power generation as of now. If those attacks continue, we might end up in a very dark place this winter.
So let us turn to what can and should be done about the situation. Since we mentioned October 7 and the conflict in the Middle East, I think it's worth recalling that on 2 instances this year, Iran launched a massive missile drone attack against Israel, both a few days ago in October, but also in April. And in April, you had a big international coalition responding, led by the United States, effectively neutralizing or helping Israelis to neutralize the attack. In the early days of the war, there were many Ukrainians who were calling for a no-fly zone over Ukraine that would be enforced by NATO and Western allies. I'm sorry to say that everybody in Washington was chicken at the time, and they decided that this was not worth risking a shooting war with a nuclear power. Why were people wrong to be afraid of using American and Western European air power to secure Ukrainian skies, in your opinion?
First of all, I have to be thankful because when American politicians finally decided to give us Patriots, we at least stood our chances with ballistic missiles. Before that, that was, a done deal. So thanks to Patriots and thanks to supply of PAC-2 and PAC-3s to us, we at least could do something with ballistics. Not in all chances, not all everywhere, but Ukrainians, we're really thankful for that. I'm a mother of 2 and my kids study in Kiev school, so every ballistic attack, I know who I have to be thankful for. But with the argument of protecting the sky over Israel, and this is a very good argument, why not use it in Ukraine? If we put nuclear weapons aside, because rumors say that Israel has it and Ukraine doesn't because of 1994 Budapest Memorandum, then not a single other argument why not the beautifully played protection shown by Western allies could not be used for at least the territory which is not on the front line, but the main part of the territory of Ukraine, let's say Western Ukraine, to stabilize the social and economic situation, to save our energy grid or whatever is left of that, and to protect the nuclear objects which we have. I should remind you that we have at least 4 atomic stations which are still on the territory that we control. So hitting those would be a big issue of ecological matter for not only us, but for our neighbors, whatever wind goes. I'm a Chernobyl survivor. I spent 1996 April in Kiev, and I do remember how things were, hidden and how things went badly for our neighbors. So we definitely don't want that to happen once again. But during one of the last attacks in late August, Russians specifically attacked the transformation capacities of those atomic stations, meaning that if God forbid they would have been successful, we would have either to stop those atomic stations from generating power, switching them off and losing up to 45% of the generation we still have, or putting them under the danger of any catastrophe that could happen. So my point is, if things could be done for Israel, we're not doing that for Ukraine, while we still stand and while we still resist. Because the big point is that our economy is still strong to support our army. Yes, we do receive financial support from Western countries, but we never use that for financing the army. And for that end, we still have economy that's working, even under blackout situations. And I would strongly urge American politicians to reconsider and to think about shutting the sky over Ukraine, at least part of it, so that we can stabilize the situation. Because this is the way how Russians do that. They cannot do much on the front line, but they use this terroristic method against our cities, our critical infrastructure, to terrorize the population.
Tell us a little bit more yet. I'm helping you advertise your own initiative, but tell us a little bit more about the Secure Sky initiative. How much would that make of a difference on the ground? What does it take to make a difference on the ground? And if people want to help, how can they do that?
We are doing our best to increase awareness about this missile crisis, and there are many ways to handle this problem. problem. One of those we already discussed with Dalibor about closing the sky. But the quickest way is to improve the supply of SAMs to NASAMs, to Patriots and other systems of Western production so that we can cope on our own as long as we need to restore our own missile production and joint productions. Those programs take place right now and are developing also with the help of American government institutions. So this is, like a plan A. Just please help us with as many SAMs as you can. We're spreading this information on how bad the situation is because, military experts know things better than I do, but politicians somehow end up being deaf to reasoning like, but we are losing the cities, we are losing economy, we are losing critical infrastructure. So I believe that this is the best effort I can do besides going to trenches, that I could help my country to sustain and stay united and stay resistant during this war.
There is a challenge, though, in relying on air defense, which involves basically shooting down the arrows as opposed to shooting back at the archer. And clearly, Ukrainians' hand has been tied on the latter, and you've been prevented from effectively going after the places and air bases and military installations deep inside of Russia, from where some of these threats are coming from. How do you see this debate evolve on allowing Ukrainians to strike deep inside of Russia? It's been going on for weeks and weeks. We were told that some resolution might be coming with the UN General Assembly, but we haven't really seen much progress. Do you think sort of things have shifted already, and maybe there won't be a formal announcement, but there'll be simply Ukrainian strikes using Western weapons against Russia, or are you skeptical that the Biden administration has taken this step?
First of all, I love this quote about the archer and arrows, about that open letter that Maria Yovanovich and others signed. This is a beautiful metaphor that describes the situation. We would definitely want to hit better. It's much easier to destroy launchers, to destroy the stocks, destroy the production sites rather than catch each and every rocket. And I should stress that Russians managed to increase their production by as much as 180 to 200 missiles per month. You can only imagine how hard it is on our hands and the intensity of the attacks that they are capable of. This campaign let Ukraine strike back, unfortunately blocked somewhere within the administration and within the White House. And I was recently in Washington and I kept asking what happened and why and what are the arguments, and nothing besides escalation paralysis. So I believe that this is the main reason why I believe that Russians know their drills how to scare Western politics. They've been doing that through Cold War beautifully. All my childhood I spent in Soviet Union, and the first time I've ever seen the air carrier when I was a member of the parliament, then American ambassador once invited me to American air carrier, and my first thought was that my childhood without chocolate was useless because we couldn't have competed with. Soviet Union couldn't compete with that, but still this escalation paralysis was done beautifully. I believe the situation right now is similar. Russia has been exhausted in terms of human technical capacities mostly, but for missiles and drones, and that's why we do this initiative. And I believe that the decision of this or next administration to Ukraine to use the long-range missiles would show the huge difference in terms of how well we can protect our civilians and our cities, because this is mostly about us being able to better control our sky and not let them put our cities in rubbles.
Lesia, thank you again for this update, and look forward to having you back on the program sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Let us now turn to our third segment, our recommendations. I have a recommendation, but let's start with you, Julia, and some opinion following data.
I do not have a current recommendation, but I still have a recommendation that is worth reading or looking through, and that is the GlobSec trends for 2024 that I believe have been entirely or almost entirely published in the past few months. There's been a little bit trickling in this month, and it fits, unfortunately, pretty well with our first segment about the state of affairs in Europe, less so the military side of things. We already talked about that, but more so the attitude side of things. And to me, what I read through these trends is essentially a miserable job, mostly by most governments in Central and Eastern Europe, done to increase resilience in our own societies and increase support for Ukraine, but also a great job done by Russian disinformation. We do not know the numbers yet of how much Russia has invested into disinformation in this space, but we do know that in Moldova, where we have elections and an EU referendum coming up this Sunday, mid-October, Russia has invested $100 million, euros, I don't remember, in disinformation just in tiny Moldova, the poorest country in Europe. So we can only imagine what they've done in Central and Eastern Europe and the rest of the countries. But here's some data, and then Dalibor, you can comment on this. Very little on Slovakia this time. Better news than in other years. So two categories. One is Euroscepticism and the other one is support for Ukraine. And within Euroscepticism, I would also put backsliding or erosion of trust in institutions. The question that they posed this year across the region has been, is Brussels just trying to dictate your country's affairs? And we have a 9% increase in the response. Yes, Brussels is just trying to dictate and is dictating in Latvia, one of the Baltic countries that we talked about a bit earlier. In the Czech Republic, support for totalitarianism, not having regular elections, not having democracy has increased. We are at 33% of Czechs that believe that a totalitarian system would be a good idea. In Romania, my country, it's even worse. About 36% believe that totalitarianism is a good idea. And partners are also important. We knew Hungary is a problem, but in Hungary, the second most important partner after Germany, there's a big competition going on between Russia and China. This year, China has overtaken Russia with 34% of Hungarians believing that China is the most important strategic partner of their country. And then on Ukraine, bear with me, in Hungary, 50% blame the West, ourselves, for the war in Ukraine, an increase in numbers over the past 2 years. In Poland, the numbers have increased of people supporting neutrality for Ukraine to 24%. Every fourth poll does not support Ukraine joining the EU or NATO. In Romania, the number of people blaming Ukraine and or the West for the war has increased by 10% over the last year to 59%, almost 60% of people. And finally, Latvia again, 12% increase of those who believe that military support for Ukraine provokes Russia. So it's not just that the numbers were bad in 2022, and we talked about them extensively at that time, but that over the last 2 years, the numbers have gotten significantly worse across the region, in many cases around 10%. And that's, I think, failure of the governments as well as Russian disinformation being effective.
It is sobering, and it kind of goes back to the very basic question of when this war ends, right? And the sort of canonical answer to that from scholars of war, from the sort of Fred Kagans of the world, is that the war ends when one of the two sides loses the will to fight. And we hope that that side be the Russians, but right now it's even sort of a party to the war that's not directly involved in the conflict is losing the will not to fight, but to provide the bare minimum to keep Ukrainians fighting. It's Ukraine's Western friends and allies that are sort of losing the will to really get their asses off the couch and just do a little bit to help, and that's really depressing. I also have one recommendation and a thought. So the recommendation is for an event I'm putting together next week at AEI on October 22nd, which is a Tuesday, on the upcoming Georgian election, which is going to be a critical make or break point for the country. We'll be talking with Georgi Kandelaki, who is a former member of the Georgian parliament. We'll be talking with William Courtney, former ambassador of the United States to Georgia, and we'll be talking with the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, a Republican from Ohio, who has been making visits to Georgia and who cares at a deep level about the future of the country. And the Georgia-related thought I want to leave our listeners with is the following one. I am afraid that what we are seeing in Georgia today might be what the future holds for Ukraine if Ukraine is forced into a bad deal with Russia. So the way this war might kind of continue, should there be some kind of a lousy deal that gives Ukrainian territory to the Russians in exchange for Russians stopping their sort of kinetic operations, is that we'll sort of open the door to Russian interference, destabilization, and kind of a breakdown of Ukraine's political system. There was a war that Russia started in 2008 in Georgia, which kind of ended as a frozen conflict, never was really resolved properly. Georgia never really had a chance to enjoy security guarantees from the West, and over time what we saw was democratic backsliding, was a sort of erosion of institutions, was an entrenchment of one Russia-connected party, and unless we are in for a pleasant surprise on the 26th of October, and I still hope for one, and I'm rooting for Georgia's civil society and activists and noble people of Georgia. It's an uphill struggle, and I fear that that's the sort of obvious path for Ukraine to take if this war is not sort of resolved in a conclusive manner, but rather kind of frozen and then abandoned by the West. So with that not exactly optimistic thought, I think it's time to wrap this one up. So thank you very much for listening to the Eastern Front, a podcast on the security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter, LinkedIn, other social media platforms. And please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics that you'd like us to cover here on the Eastern Front. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.